The Labour Party appears to have turned Birmingham into a putrid biohazard. There is an ongoing bin strike that has left the city looking like a giant rubbish dump.
I'm 74 and I'm having to carry my own bin bag up a hill and everything to empty it.
Over 1 million residents in instability, 3,000 refused workers left in crisis, and nearly 9 months of unresolved failure. What began as a local dispute has now spilled onto the streets. Picket lines have grown, marches have formed, and even agency workers hired to keep Birmingham running have joined the strike. This is no longer just about waste collection. It's about a system that has stopped responding. When a city of this size loses control of its most basic services, this is no longer just Birmingham's problem. It becomes a national warning. Tonight, the cost begins to multiply.
When you see images going around the country of the state of Birmingham at the moment, how does that make you feel?
Ashamed. Yeah.
At the centre of this crisis is a decision that never found an exit. Under Labour control, Birmingham City Council moved to scrap a role unique to its waste service, citing unaffordable costs after a massive equal pay ruling. The change would reduce staffing per vehicle by up to 40% and cut individual workers' pay by up to £8,000 a year. Crews were being asked to do more with less. With fewer staff on each round, unions warned of rising safety risks as workers faced heavier loads and longer routes. The council argued there was no alternative. Negotiations followed. According to union representatives, a provisional agreement was reached, then withdrawn. From that point on, the dispute stalled. No final offer, no clear timeline, no decision to resolve or escalate. What made the situation more volatile was the absence of intervention beyond the local level. As months passed, there was no signal that anyone above the council was prepared to step in. Instead, responsibility blurred, delay replaced direction, and the system shifted from resolution to containment. Agency workers were brought in to keep services moving. They raised concerns over safety and conditions. Then they voted to join the strike themselves. That moment changed the nature of the dispute. This was no longer a disagreement being negotiated. It was the system failing to stabilise itself. When a system demands more output with fewer hands, and even its emergency measures collapse, the conflict does not disappear. It surfaces. The failure stopped being abstract when the city began to back up. Rubbish piled along residential streets. Black bags stacked against shop fronts, wheelie bins overflowed for weeks at a time. In some areas, waste was no longer contained to pavements. It spilled into alleyways, around schools and outside nurseries and health centres. Residents reported the smell first, then flies, then rats. What had been described as a temporary disruption became a daily reality. Local businesses began arranging private collections. Residents drove waste to mobile tips themselves. Others had no option but to leave it outside their homes. This was not a single missed collection. It was accumulation, and accumulation changes behaviour. Fly tipping increased. Furniture appeared on street corners. Mattresses were dumped beside food waste. At this point, the dispute crossed a line. The city was no longer waiting for a solution. It was living with the consequences. Public frustration hardened into anger. Council statements spoke of negotiations. Residents looked at streets that hadn't been cleared in months. That gap between explanation and experience destroyed what remained of trust. By the time agency workers walked out, the system had already lost credibility on the ground. The city had become the evidence. Pressure eventually finds a direction. In Birmingham, it moved outward. Picket lines turned into marches. Small gatherings became organised demonstrations. Chants echoed through city centres. Workers strike, workers win. Union power. Refused workers stood shoulder to shoulder with agency staff. Some had been hired to break the strike weeks earlier. Now they were carrying placards themselves. This was the turning point. What began as an industrial dispute became a public confrontation. The message was no longer technical, it was visceral. An £8,000 pay cut, more work with fewer hands, rising bills, no resolution. Residents joined in, not as activists, but as people fed up with living in the fallout. At this stage, the dispute could no longer be managed quietly. It demanded response. Under Labour control locally, the situation remained unresolved. Nationally, there was still no visible intervention. That silence amplified the noise on the streets, because when cities protest, they rarely do so alone. They become signals, and Birmingham had become one. A warning of what happens when delay meets daily reality, when governance stalls and the public steps in. This was the peak. Not because it was loud, but because it was unavoidable. What turns a city crisis into a national concern is not scale alone, it is precedent. Birmingham is not an isolated council, it is the largest local authority in Europe, operating under the same legal, financial and political framework as councils across England. When a dispute of this magnitude drags on unresolved, it exposes weaknesses far beyond City Hall. At this stage, attention inevitably shifts upward. Questions begin to form not just about Birmingham City Council, but about the system that oversees it, the safeguards meant to prevent prolonged paralysis, and the thresholds at which central government is expected to act. From Westminster, there has been no decisive intervention, no emergency framework, no visible effort to break the deadlock. That absence matters because when local government fails repeatedly without correction, it signals tolerance from above. And tolerance sets precedent. Other councils are watching, other disputes are taking notes. If Birmingham can drift for months without resolution, why would smaller authorities expect faster action? If workers here are told to absorb cuts and do more with less, what message does that send nationally? This is how local breakdowns scale into national risk, not through collapse, but through repetition. A system that allows paralysis to persist does not contain crisis, it distributes it. For the Labour Party, Birmingham presents a problem that extends beyond local governance. This dispute unfolded under Labour control at the council level, but its implications now reach the party nationally. Labour positions itself as the party of workers, fairness and public services. Yet here, workers under a Labour-led authority were told to accept significant pay cuts during a cost of living crisis. That contradiction is difficult to ignore. At the national level, Labour leadership has remained cautious. Intervening risks validating union demands, staying silent risks alienating core supporters. This is the dilemma. Because Birmingham is not just a city, it is a test case. How Labour responds or chooses not to respond will be read as a signal by workers, unions and councils facing similar pressures. A party that aspires to govern nationally cannot afford prolonged ambiguity when its values are being tested in real time. Silence does not remain neutral for long. In moments like this, it becomes a position of its own. The longer the crisis persists without national engagement, the more it reframes Labour's relationship with the people it claims to represent. This is no longer about bins or budgets, it is about credibility. At its core, this crisis is not about bins. It is about people. Workers asked to absorb losses they cannot afford. Families asked to live amid conditions they did not create. Communities left to navigate consequences without clarity or protection. When systems fail, it is rarely abstract. It shows up in daily life, in health, in dignity and in trust. The lesson from Birmingham is not simply about governance or budgets. It is about what happens when institutions forget who they exist to serve. Public services are not optional, they are the foundation of social trust. When that trust erodes, rebuilding it takes far longer than preventing its collapse. This crisis reminds us that efficiency without humanity is fragile, that cost-cutting without consent creates resistance, and that silence at the wrong moment can be as damaging as the wrong decision. The real measure of leadership is not avoiding conflict, it is confronting it early, transparently, and with empathy. Birmingham's warning is not about one city failing. It is about what happens when systems lose sight of people, and that lesson matters far beyond this moment.